You ignore them for just a few seconds and watch their confidence shatter. The silence hits harder than any insult. Other person is talking loudly, confidently, taking up space. They make a claim about themselves that isn't quite true. You don't argue. You don't nod along. You just don't respond. You glance away. You let the silence sit. And for a split second, something shifts in their expression. A flicker, almost imperceptible, like a screen glitching before the image stabilizes again. You just watched them experience something they are not equipped to process. You just watched them confront the one thing their entire psychological architecture was built to avoid: being ignored, not disagreed with, not challenged, ignored. And for certain personality structures, that silence is louder than any insult, more destabilizing than any argument. It doesn't just irritate them. It threatens the very foundation of how they exist in the world. This is not about petty revenge. This is not about strategies for winning social battles. This is about understanding a fundamental psychological truth. For some individuals, attention functions like oxygen. And when you remove it, what surfaces is not anger. It is a collapse of self. To understand why narcissists hate being ignored, you have to first understand what narcissism actually is beneath the surface-level portrayals. We tend to think of it as vanity, arrogance, an inflated sense of self-importance. But clinically, narcissism is not an excess of self-love. It is a deficit of self, a fragile, unstable self-structure that requires constant external reinforcement to feel real. Here's a way to visualize it. Imagine a building that looks magnificent from the outside. Grand columns, ornate facades, towering presence. But inside, the structure is hollow. No internal supports, no foundation. The building doesn't stand on its own. It stands because people keep looking at it. Every gaze is a brace. Every acknowledgement is a steel beam. Remove enough of those external supports, and the building doesn't just crack. It begins to realize it was never truly standing to begin with. That is the psychological architecture of the narcissistic individual. The self is not generated from within. It is reflected from without. Which means the experience of being ignored is not merely unpleasant. It is existentially disorienting. It strips away the external scaffolding that holds the sense of self in place. And what remains is not humility or self-reflection. It is a terrifying vacuum. Consider a micro-scenario. A man in a professional setting pitches an idea in a meeting. He's used to being the dominant voice in the room. The usual nods, the deferred glances, the subtle signs of deference. But this time, the room responds differently. Not with criticism, but with silence. The team lead turns to someone else. The conversation moves on without acknowledgement. In that moment, the man doesn't process this as a professional setback. He processes it as a disappearance, because the self he brought into that room only exists in the reflection of others' attention. When the mirror goes dark, so does he. What happens next is not about the idea. It's about restoring the reflection. He may escalate, speak louder, repeat himself, manufacture a reason to pull attention back. Or he may withdraw and, later, engage in a campaign of subtle punishment designed not to regain respect, but to prove that he was always the one who mattered. The behavior that follows is often misread as ego or arrogance, but at its core, it is a frantic attempt to re-establish the external structure that makes internal existence possible. This brings us to the first psychological mechanism at play, the collapse of the external self-regulatory system. Most humans have what psychologists call a relatively stable self-concept. When someone ignores us, we might feel annoyed, slighted, or confused. But we don't cease to know who we are. The self is internally anchored. For the narcissistic individual, the regulatory system is external. Attention, admiration, and even negative attention, as long as it is attention, functions as a regulatory mechanism. It stabilizes mood, maintains self-esteem, and confirms existence. When attention is withheld, the regulatory system fails. And because there is no robust internal system to fall back on, the individual experiences what feels like psychological suffocation. This is not metaphorical. Functional MRI studies on social exclusion show that the brain regions activated by being ignored overlap significantly with those activated by physical pain. For individuals with narcissistic traits, that activation is often more intense and more prolonged. They aren't just hurt. They are, neurologically, in pain. But here's what most people don't realize. The hatred of being ignored is not just about the pain of exclusion. It's about the exposure of something the narcissist spends enormous energy hiding, the absence of a stable self. When you ignore someone with this psychological structure, you are not simply being rude or dismissive. You are forcing them to experience the very thing they've organized their entire life around avoiding, the awareness that the self they present is not anchored to anything solid. And that awareness is unbearable. Which is why the response is almost never introspection. It is almost always externalization. This is where the second mechanism comes in, the transformation of absence into threat. When attention disappears, the narcissistic mind must construct an explanation. But the explanation cannot be, I am not inherently worthy of attention. That would require a level of self-reflection the architecture cannot support. Instead, the mind constructs a narrative in which the person withholding attention is not neutral, but actively hostile, jealous, threatened, or defective. The absence of attention is reinterpreted as a deliberate act of aggression. Because if you are ignoring them, you must be doing so out of envy, ignorance, or malice. Anything else would require confronting the hollow space where a stable self should be. This narrative shift serves a critical function. It transforms the experience from one of existential vulnerability to one of righteous indignation. Indignation is energizing. Vulnerability is paralyzing. So the mind chooses indignation every time. The narcissist doesn't just hate being ignored. They begin to believe that your act of ignoring them proves something about your character, not theirs. And in that reframing, they regain a sense of control. They are no longer the person who disappeared when the mirror went dark. They are the person being unfairly targeted by a lesser individual. This is why attempts to set boundaries with narcissistic individuals often escalate rather than resolve. A boundary, silence, distance, non-engagement is not experienced as a healthy limit. It is experienced as an attack. And because the internal structure cannot withstand the vulnerability of that attack, the response must be to escalate, to provoke, to force a reaction that reestablishes the external regulation system. Now, here is where it becomes dangerous. And this is the part most people completely miss. When you ignore a narcissistic individual, you are not just triggering anger or frustration. You are triggering a collapse that can result in what psychologists call narcissistic injury, a wound so profound that it bypasses all normal emotional regulation and taps into something far more primal. The response to narcissistic injury is often not proportional to the event. It can look like a sudden, unpredictable eruption. Smear campaigns, legal battles, stalking behaviors. Not because the person is inherently violent or evil, but because the structural collapse of the self leaves only one psychological imperative: restore the structure at any cost. This is not an excuse. It is a warning. Understanding the depth of what happens when a narcissist is ignored is essential for anyone who must navigate relationships with such individuals, whether in family systems, romantic partnerships, or professional environments. Ignoring is often recommended as a strategy, and in theory, it makes sense. Withhold the attention that fuels the behavior. But in practice, the withdrawal of attention can trigger an escalation that is far more destructive than the original dynamic. So what is the alternative? This brings us to the hidden layer underneath the entire phenomenon. The hatred of being ignored is not really about you. It is about the other person's inability to generate selfhood from within. And the moment you recognize that, the dynamic shifts. You stop asking, why are they reacting this way? and start understanding. They are reacting to the collapse of a system I did not build and cannot stabilize. The practical awareness takeaway is this: when you must disengage from a narcissistic individual, the most effective approach is not silent withdrawal. It is what psychologists call gray rock, with emotional neutrality and structural clarity. You don't seek to punish through silence. You simply become uninteresting. You provide no emotional fuel, but you also provide no mystery. Mystery implies hidden attention. Neutrality implies none. You are present, but not reactive. You respond, but you do not engage. You become a surface that reflects nothing back. This is difficult, because the narcissistic individual's entire mechanism is designed to provoke reaction. They will test the neutrality. They will escalate to see if the surface cracks. And if it does, they are back in the system, regulated, stabilized, fed. But if it holds, something else begins to happen. Slowly, they will seek other sources of regulation. Not because they have achieved self-awareness, but because the survival imperative is stronger than the fixation. Now, close the loop on where we began. That conversation. The silence you held, the flicker you saw. You now understand what passed through that moment. Not anger, not ego. Collapse. A brief, terrifying exposure to the absence of self. And the frantic recalibration that followed was not about you. It was about a person trying to reconstruct a sense of existence from the only materials they have ever known, the attention of others. Here's something worth sitting with. If attention is the mirror that makes the self feel real, what happens to a person who has spent their entire life looking into that mirror, never knowing they were supposed to build something that exists without it? And when that mirror goes dark, are they reacting to you or to the sudden, unbearable awareness that they have never truly known who they are when no one is watching?